So what I want to do today is just give you a brief overview of what's in the report. It's quite long, it's quite thick, so I'm just going to pick out what I think are perhaps the most interesting points. It's called Warrior Nation because it struck me that Britain has been at war for a long time, in some estimates hundreds of years, and so the idea of Britain being kind of almost permanently at war, what impact does this have on British politics and society? And the power of the military in British politics and society isn't often considered. It's a much more kind of hidden influence that the military can hold. It wasn't so much the case in the First World War, when there was severe tension between politicians and the military over the conduct of the war, particularly between Lloyd George and John French and General Haig. In the Second World War, partly because of the legacy of World War I, Churchill was able to assert his dominance over the military, and those political military tensions didn't so much bubble to the surface until some of them wrote their diaries subsequently. So in the post-war period, I think that the military's influence has bubbled to the surface occasionally, but since 2003 and the invasion of Iraq, I think the evidence is now coming to the surface of the powerful influence of the military in British politics and society. So this was what the report's about, and about whether politicians are able to exert control over the military. So first of all, the Iraq War in 2003, when the Chilcot report came out, the focus was very much on Tony Blair and his responsibility for the Iraq War and leading Britain to war. What some of that coverage missed was the role of the military behind the scenes in pushing for maximum British involvement. So when Tony Blair wrote this to President George Bush, "I will be with you whatever," Britain hadn't decided what the nature was of its military contribution to the invasion. And there were three packages on offer at that point. Packages 1 and 2 didn't involve substantial ground forces, but the military were using its influence, and particularly the army behind the scenes, to have their maximum involvement in the invasion. And that was because the army's organisational interests were better going to be achieved by having maximum involvement. What the military also did was they used their diplomacy with the US military and said to the US military, look, we're interested in becoming involved, and we're interested in making a very large contribution to the invasion. And the US military then took that to President George Bush, who then presents that to Tony Blair at a meeting on the 7th of September 2003. And Tony Blair is kind of blindsided by what's happening here, and he feels that he's being manipulated into this package 3, which means 46,000 British military personnel are going to be involved in the invasion. And in the end, Blair goes ahead and consents to the military and the army having this kind of maximal package, the package 3, and so the invasion takes place. This invasion in itself breaks the Harmony Guidelines, and the Harmony Guidelines are supposed to make sure that there's intervals between tours for military personnel so that their mental and physical health isn't affected adversely by deployment. Oops. So the military then, having pursued the war in Iraq, turn their attention to Afghanistan and want involvement in the deployment to Helmand in 2006. And here again, the military want to get out of Iraq. They were hoping that they would get in for the invasion and then be able to pull out. Hopefully democracy, peace and justice would arrive in Iraq, and they would be able to pull out without having to do post-invasion conflict management. So their attention turns to Afghanistan, and they lobby within the British state for the mission to Helmand. The evidence seems to show from Chilcot that the politicians follow the military's advice. The military say, look, we can fight these wars on two fronts. As we withdraw troops from Iraq, we'll be able to transfer them to Afghanistan, and we will be able to fight these wars simultaneously. Of course, this isn't what the military have planned for, and so doubt is cast on their ability to do this, and the military reassure the politicians that yes, they can. And there's a question of deception as to the military are selling the deployment to Afghanistan in 2006 as peace building, as reconstruction and development in central Helmand. They sell it in that way to the politicians because the politicians are nervous. After the invasion of Iraq and the deterioration of the situation in Iraq into war, British public opinion is highly skeptical about another military adventure. So the military are selling the operation in Afghanistan as peace building rather than war fighting. Now, there's some evidence to suggest that some of the intelligence reports coming out of Afghanistan prior to deployment suggest that if the British deploy, that they will get involved in warfighting, and that the Taliban resistance there is increasing, and particularly because of Britain's historical role in Afghanistan, that this will be a very hot deployment if they deploy to Helmand. There's some evidence that intelligence is suppressed and doesn't reach the politicians, and here we need to know to what extent the politicians at the top, Blair and maybe Reid, whether they thought that this deployment would lead to war fighting or whether they were actually convinced that this was going to involve just peace building. John Reid said he would be perfectly happy if not a shot was fired after 3 years of the British deployment, which suggests that Reid believed that the mission to Helmand was going to be involved in peace building rather than war fighting. Of course, the military sent the parachute regiment out there as part of this peace-building mission, and the parachute regiment's not usually associated with peace-building. Also, the Apache helicopters were deployed as well, again, high levels of force. Some people have claimed that the soldiers that were training to go out were training to do war fighting rather than peace-building. Not long after the deployment to Afghanistan in April 2006, the nature of the mission changes fundamentally from peace building in the centre of Helmand to British troops being deployed to the platoon houses in North Helmand, where they're surrounded by the Taliban and have to call in airstrikes, destroy these towns in a bid to prevent themselves from being overrun. The mission is fundamentally changed, and there's evidence to suggest that this was not passed up the chain of command to the politicians, that they didn't approve this change of mission from peace building in central Helmand to war fighting in the platoon houses of northern Helmand. Okay, so the deployment in Helmand in 2006 leaves the British Army fighting in both Iraq and Afghanistan. This creates a crisis because all of a sudden the British are involved in war fighting in Afghanistan. The head of the British Army, General Sir Richard Danner, then says the army's running hot and it can barely cope. So the military, having asked for these two operations to run simultaneously, find themselves in crisis and then say, look, we're in crisis and it's the politicians that have put us in this place. They're concerned in Helmand that they're war fighting and that they've deployed for peace building, so they don't have enough troops out there, so they have to rapidly try and reinforce them. Also, they're concerned about the nature of the equipment they have, their lack of helicopters, and the lack of vehicles that can withstand IEDs. In addition, the army has perennial recruitment problems, so it's concerned about its ability to recruit new soldiers to go out and fight. When these soldiers are then getting wounded and coming back to Britain, they're in NHS hospitals and they're complaining about the quality of the NHS hospitals that they're finding themselves in. They're pushing for higher defence spending. They believe that the British people and the government should respect the military more, and they're concerned that public opinion is not behind the war in Iraq and Afghanistan. And here, this this is a kind of an average of opinion polls taken from 2002 to 2010. And 2006 here, this is the period when the British deployed to Helmand. And as you can see, the average line here shows that a majority of British people opposed the war in Afghanistan from the very beginning, from 2006. And so the politicians then find themselves in a crisis situation where they're deployed in two places, and these wars are both unpopular. And this creates difficulties for the army, but also for the politicians as well. Where are we? Yeah, next one. Bam. Okay, so the argument in the report is that the army then go on the offensive, so to speak. And in October 2006, General Sir Richard Dannett gives an interview in the Daily Mail in which he says, "We must quit Iraq," says the new head of the army. Part of the impetus is we leave Iraq and we transfer to Afghanistan, we leave the bad war and we get into the good war in Afghanistan, which has widespread not popular support, but political support. All the major British parties are supporting the war in Afghanistan. Dannett also says that the military covenant is broken between the British people, the government, and the military. And by saying this all publicly, Dannett is breaking a constitutional convention that the military do not publicly criticise the politicians. So this is a major initiative by the head of the British Army launching a public attack on the politicians. The military covenant is interesting because some people date it from the early 19th century, from the time of Lord Wellington, but in fact this is an invention by the military in the year 2000, in this obscure document, Soldiering the Military Covenant. They decide in that document that there is a covenant between the British people, the government, and the military. And this covenant basically means, I mean, there's lots of different interpretations, but it's supposed to mean that in return for the military risking their lives in foreign conflicts, the government and the British people must support them and support them in a kind of moral way, a political way, but also a material way in terms of respect and recognition for the armed forces. The military covenant is highly ambiguous as to what it means, and this means that kind of right-wing militarists can use it to generate greater support for the military, greater support for the war, greater support for further military adventures. But also people on the left, like Jeremy Corbyn, who's not so into war, can argue that the military covenant is about fair treatment for armed forces personnel, that it's making sure that armed forces personnel are treated in a reasonable and a fair way. The military covenant is referenced in the Armed Forces Act in 2011, and it's widely popularly supported by the media, by the main political parties. And as a result of the Armed Forces Covenant, there are community and corporate covenants across Britain. Oops. This bar chart here is in the report, and it just indicates that prior to 2006, the military covenant is hardly mentioned in British newspapers. So this is a database of British newspapers, UK newsstand, and prior to 2006 it's barely mentioned. Then all of a sudden everyone's discussing the military covenant and the coverage of it shoots up. So it's an invention out of nothing in the year 2000, but because people are talking about it, it kind of becomes real and it becomes a thing. And it's used to promote militarization. Oops. So the military, actually a pretty popular institution within British society. They're often up there in opinion polls with the NHS and the BBC. So the military have got a problem. If your institution's already highly popular, how do you make it yet still further popular? And so they achieve this partly by the generation of moral panic. And there's a couple of key examples in the report, and one's from Abingdon in Oxfordshire. And it's claimed that the people of Abingdon do not turn out for a homecoming parade for soldiers returning from Afghanistan. There's a picture down here, you can't quite see it, but but it's of soldiers marching through the streets of Abingdon, and hardly anyone, Joe Public's not turned out for them. Bad Joe Public. Turns out, of course, when you look more closely, that the regiment did not want a homecoming parade. There was a funeral for one of their comrades on the day of that homecoming, and so they hadn't wanted people to turn out. However, a year later, Abingdon is contrasted with Colchester. Here's Colchester with people out in the streets, and here's bad Abingdon, didn't turn out. And this is supposed to be particularly appalling because this is happening in Middle England. I think it's Murison, Conservative MP, kind of says, well, you know, if this was happening in the inner city, we kind of understand it. But this is the heart of Middle England. People aren't turning out in Middle England. We've really got to worry. There's another incident at Leatherhead Leisure Centre in 2006. And what happens there is Headley Court is not far from Leatherhead Leisure Centre, and the soldiers in Headley Court are there for rehabilitation. And they've been using the pool at the Leatherhead Leisure Centre. And there's an incident where it's alleged that two women complain about the presence of the soldiers in the pool, the scandal, and the instructor takes the troops out of the pool. This hits the local press, gets picked up nationally. Of course, in the days of Tinternet, this goes global. And so the manager of the leisure centre was getting death threats from people who were claiming that these soldiers had been disrespected by the leisure centre or the manager. On closer inspection, it turns out that this incident was either exaggerated or came out of nothing. When a police inspector looked into it, because this is discrimination against disabled people, the inspector could find no real evidence of an incident having occurring. So a number of these similar incidents where soldiers might not be served in pubs are blown up, and they're either invented or exaggerated in order to generate the moral panic that then provokes a defensive reaction. And in Leatherhead, you know, the week before there'd been great turnout for Remembrance Sunday, and subsequently there was all these letters into the Leatherhead Advertiser, you know, expressing sympathy for the soldiers and outrage that this had happened to them. The politicians, of course, have to respond to this outrage, and Brown sets up this national inquiry, and in 2008 it looks into all these incidents and reports very few unpleasant incidents, which you kind of expect given the general popularity of the military at this time. Wootton Bassett, in 2007 to 11, the kind of spontaneous commemoration of Wootton Bassett might suggest popularity of the military within British society rather than hostility. The problem for the military is that they suspect that the Wootton Bassett commemoration, by seeing the soldiers as victims, actually leads public opinion to oppose the wars that they're fighting, that this can reinforce an anti-war feeling amongst domestic public opinion. Oops. So, Emma's going to talk more about instances of militarisation, but some of the initiatives include Veterans Day, which was founded in 2006 and then is turned into Armed Forces Day. But there's also the promotion of the military ethos in schools in any number of incidents that Emma is far more across than I am. But there's also developments in civil society, such as military charities. The Help for Heroes charity was founded a few weeks before the Leatherhead Leisure Centre incident. And it was founded, and its key demand was a swimming pool at Headley Court. So the incident at Leatherhead played into Help for Heroes because it generated greater support for a swimming pool being built at Headley Court. Was this coincidence? We can see with the Millies, the Sons Award for military heroism, but also in kind of other initiatives like military fitness or military wives, the military choir. We see a number of ways in which militarisation is happening in British society. Oh, Lord. Right, so this is a big table with a lot of figures, and Freedom of Information requested this because it was opinion polling done by the Ministry of Defence on the popularity of the armed forces. And what it generally shows is that the armed forces are very popular. There was a bit of a dip here in the wake of the invasion of Iraq, down to 54% favourability. But even as General Danner is complaining in 2006, 2007 about the breaking of the military covenant and the British people not being behind the armed forces, the private opinion polls for the Ministry of Defence are saying that's not actually true, that the military are actually very popular. But the popularity levels go from 69% right up until nearly 90%. I mean, here, there's some suggestion that this militarisation does have an impact on the popularity of the armed forces. However, this support for the troops doesn't translate in support for the wars that they're fighting. And consistently, public opinion is able to make that distinction between supporting the military and supporting the wars. And they consistently oppose these wars. What's also interesting as well is that in spite of this militarisation, people are still not joining up, and the military still have problems with recruitment. Also, there is a vulnerability of the military to this image of generals being the donkeys that are leading the lions, that goes back to World War I and goes back to the image of Blackadder. Yeah, and this Blackadder image, oh, what a lovely war, the military really find very threatening. And there's some evidence in opinion polls that that image of the generals persists. And of course, popular opinion's opposition to the war in Afghanistan actually puts operational constraints on the military. They can't undertake certain activities in Afghanistan because they fear military losses. And they fear that, should a helicopter get blown up, that those kind of catastrophic losses would lead to an unstoppable shift in support for withdrawal from Afghanistan. Press the wrong button every time. So, coming back to then the power of the military, apparent failure in Iraq and Afghanistan has been turned against the politicians. The military claim the politicians have stabbed them in the back, that just as the military were winning in Afghanistan in 2009 to 11, it was the politicians in Britain and the United States that decided that they were going to draw down and pull the troops out. And that undermined the success that they were having in 2009 to 11. During Labour governments, the Conservatives worked to some extent with the military to attack the Labour government over equipment, over other inadequacies, defence expenditure. This was quite a powerful way of attacking the Labour governments. When David Cameron comes in, becomes Prime Minister in 2010, the military are then putting pressure on him and his policy, until he makes an outburst over Libya in 2011, where he publicly says to the military, I tell you what, you do the fighting and I'll do the talking. And he feels that pressure during his time in government 2010 to 2015, because the generals are publicly and privately trying to pressurise the government into staying the course in Afghanistan, but also putting pressure on them to increase defence expenditure to 2%, which in the end they succeed in doing. When Jeremy Corbyn becomes Labour leader in 2015, a serving general is quoted in the Sunday Times making threats against the Labour government should Jeremy Corbyn become Prime Minister. Sorry? Well, could be wrong. But the general's quoted anonymously, essentially saying that if Corbyn was elected Prime Minister, then there might be mutiny and there would be non-cooperation, at least from generals, over this. In the election last year, the Labour Party actually also committed itself to 2% defence expenditure. So during this time, both the Conservatives and the Labour Party ended up committing themselves to 2% defence expenditure. Now, having achieved that, the next goal seems to be pushing it up to 3%. And some of you might have seen the headline in the Mail on Sunday yesterday where the Defence Secretary Gavin Williamson decided that if he wasn't given £20 billion from Theresa May, then he would bring her down. And the problem here is that the chair of the Defence Committee, Julian Lewis, supports 3%. The chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee is Christopher Tugendhat, who's ex-military as well. He was an assistant to the Chief of Defence Staff. So now what you have is a considerable number of Tory MPs who are military veterans, who are strongly lobbying for increases in defence expenditure. And it was this that Cameron was actually complaining about, that these backbench Tory MPs were working with the military to ratchet up defence expenditure. Not only that, they've had the US president there, had Barack Obama, the US military, also putting pressure on British governments to increase defence expenditure. So we get the idea here of the military and maybe the industrial complex as well, because defence expenditure is big business, but with a number of other groups within British society that are part of this network that are pushing for increased defence expenditure and to increase the power of the military. And this was from Nia Griffiths this morning, Labour's Shadow Defence Secretary. She said, now I don't want to prejudge any possible uplift in defence spending that might come ahead of next month's NATO summit, and let me be clear, the opposition would warmly welcome any rise. So here you've got Labour's spokesperson on defence saying they want to increase defence expenditure as well, and this in a Corbyn-led Labour Party. So in conclusion, you know, the hidden power of the military has bubbled to the surface, I think, a bit more since 2003. And the Chilcot report in particular provides evidence of the power of the military in pressurising governments to do its bidding. And here what's interesting as well is that it's not just left-wing commentators that are drawing attention to the power of the military, but you get people on the right, people like Max Hastings, who seems to be concerned about the power. He's a military historian, but he's still concerned about the power of the military within the British state. I've argued that since 2006, there's been this militarisation offensive, and the military have broken constitutional conventions that they don't publicly criticise politicians. I think here, with defence expenditure increases, we can see the demonstrable power of the military. This isn't just in the United Kingdom, but also in the United States. President Obama had considerable problems with his generals, who were also publicly lobbying him to stay the course in Afghanistan. And it was only by some very clever manoeuvring that he was able to surge, but set an end date on that surge and draw down US troops from Afghanistan. So this problem of democratic control of the military is not just apparent in the UK, but also in the United States. And that's me.